Philosophy, theology, and metaphysics. This is the Veritas Podcast, the weekly show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. Hello, welcome. He's Robert. I'm Robert. This is the Veritas Podcast. This is Pascendi Part 12. We apologize for missing last week, so we're just going to jump right into it this week. We're going to be discussing paragraphs 24 and 25. In paragraph 24, Pius discusses church-state relations. In this paragraph, he discusses the Modernist view and its plan for the church as it relates to government. The Modernist says that if the church wants to stay relevant, it must concede its authority to the state. Remember that Modernists are really obsessed with relevance and novelty and being current, and so they expect the church to do that as well. The Modernist accuses the church of only caring about Catholics in this paragraph. Modernist wants Catholics to not use the church as a guiding principle for them or others. They don't think that the church has the right to say what's right or wrong. They don't want to hear about right or wrong either, especially from the church, but want others to simply go by what they think is best. And this is this idea of conscience we'll discuss later. This, Pius says, has already been condemned by Pius VI in his Apostolic Constitution. Rob, it's not really a stretch to see false ecumenism in this description.
The seeds of false ecumenism are definitely there, since it undermines objective truth, which then results in religious truth becoming just a matter of personal opinion. And then the result of that is that all religions are then placed on the same level. And once that happens, they're just there to work together, the religions to work together for the betterment of man, which is what we see today with false ecumenism. So the seeds are definitely there. But something else to point out about paragraph 24 is the dualism and the unnatural separation, which is a characteristic of modernism. And we see this. There's a separation there between church and state. They want to separate church from the state. And there's also a separation between the individual as a Catholic and the individual Catholic as a citizen. So you're a Catholic on Sunday and in your private life, but as a citizen, you're supposed to not let your Catholicism influence your behavior. So a separation between the church and the state, and a separation between the person, between his Catholicism and his being a citizen of the state. And both of these errors can be traced back to Luther. Really, Luther, a lot of these errors can be traced, at least in their seed form, back to Luther, including these two errors. Luther taught that the Christian ruler should not allow his religious beliefs to influence the way he governed. And he actually said there should be what he called a, quote, profound separation between the man or the Christian as a governor and the Christian just as an individual Christian at home. This is what Luther wrote. He said, quote, "You are a prince or judge. You have people under you, and you wish to know what to do. It is not Christ you are to question concerning this matter, but the law of your country. Between the Christian and the ruler, a profound separation must be made. Assuredly, a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he ought to govern. The man is a Christian, but his function does not concern religion. They are founded in the same man, but the two states or functions are perfectly marked off one from another and really opposed." So you see the dualism there, the separation. Luther separates what shouldn't be separated. And in this error, it eventually led to, and it makes perfect sense that it would, it led to the error of separation of church and state, and then also to the separation between not only the Christian ruler from the teachings of Christ, but also the individual from the church, which basically means that just as the state has no duty to look to the church for guidance, Well, neither does the individual Catholic have a duty to conform his life to what the Church teaches. That's kind of what that dualism is. And the end result is that the temporal order, the state, is eventually placed above, it's separated from and placed above the supernatural order. And the fallible judgment of the individual is then separated and then placed above the infallible judgment of the Church. So, first there's the separation, then there's an inversion which places the lesser above the greater, the state above the Church, the individual reason above the teachings revealed by God and the judgments of the Church. And we saw a similar inversion, a similar type inversion in the previous paragraph, where Pius X discussed how the modernists first separate science from faith, and then they place the fallible conclusions of the scientists above the infallible teachings of the Church. So this is the common characteristic of modernism. They always separate what should be joined together, and then after separating the two, they invert the order by placing the lower, by placing the lesser in a superior position over the greater. Again, you see this everywhere. It's a very common characteristic applied to a lot of different areas. But in reality, just to give the teaching of the Church on this matter, the Church and state, they should work together for the good of the whole man, for the good of body and soul. And although the state is primarily concerned with temporal affairs, with the affairs of the body, and the Church is primarily concerned with spiritual affairs, nevertheless, the state has a duty to submit to the Church in matters relating to faith and morals, especially when it comes to framing its laws. Because the purpose of the law is to guide man to his proper end. And it does it to help guide man to his proper end, which it does by encouraging what God encourages and forbidding what God forbids. We talked about this in our encyclical on Libertas. Our intellect and our will are both defective due to the fall. Our intellect will often judge wrong. It'll be mistaken in its judgment. So the law helps the intellect by showing it what's true. It shows it what's true and good so that it's less likely to err in its judgment. It just looks at the law, it knows what's good, and it conforms. And then the will, we talked about the will, how it will tend to choose something other than what it should choose. And the law also helps the will by the penalties attached to the law. So the law will say, do this and don't do that, and that helps the intellect. But then if the law also has a penalty attached to it, so if you violate the law, something bad's going to happen to you. Well, that helps the will to choose what it ought to choose because the will doesn't want to get punished. So the law is intended to help guide us in our actions. The law is not intended, as the liberals claim, to preserve man's right, quote-unquote right, to do what he pleases as long as it doesn't harm another person. That's what the liberals say, liberals and libertarians. They say law's just there to preserve our right to be able to do whatever we want as long as we don't harm someone else. That's not true. That's not correct. The purpose of the law is to guide man in his actions by forbidding what God forbids and encouraging what God encourages so that man can then more easily arrive at the end for which he was created. And since the Church is the divinely established teacher of revealed truths, the state has a duty to look to the Church for guidance when it frames its laws. And also, as Leo XIII teaches in Immortality Dei, which is a great encyclical, the state also has a duty to profess the true religion. the state has a duty to offer public worship to God, to be a Catholic country and profess the true religion. That's something that's foreign to our way of thinking today, but that's the way it should be. But when the church... Yeah.
Rob, let me interject for a minute. You made a really good point as well. I'm not sure if you realize that about the definition that the liberals and libertarians put on this, that laws are there just to preserve man's rights, and that's contradictory to the Catholic churches. What we'll see later on is modernists change the definition, and they set the framework for the debate. And so if you were to debate that exact point with a liberal or a modernist, he or she might say, what are you talking about? That's not the purpose or the point of law. And we've talked about this so many times before in this, not only this series, but in our entire show, that people don't know how to think, much less what to think. And so, Rob, if you were to say, no, the purpose of the law is what the Catholic Church teaches, to direct man towards his good, they would not even understand that. Right. And so, you're forced almost, as all of us are, to come down to their dysfunctional and crooked way of thinking to debate them even with that.
Or just explain to them what the real purpose of law is, which I think some people would actually be able to understand what the reason for law is, especially when you go into the intellect and the will. If they're able to follow, to me it just makes so much sense that some will be able to understand, but others are just so lost in error, like you said, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. But
no, and you're right. I mean, some people who are open, that might work, but if they have never even heard of those terms or those points, the will, the intellect, that sort of thing, then they can't even follow you. You almost have to, go back years and years of education, in a sense, to explain it to them first, and then come back to the original argument that you were having with them.
Yeah, that's right. It can be really frustrating trying to get through to people today, but you just do the best you can, and you kind of try to let God handle the results. But as for our part, we can study this, we can learn the truth, and we can do our best to help other people see the truth and give them things to read and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's not easy, especially when people have been so brainwashed with errors like most people have today.
Yep, let's continue.
Okay, but one thing I wanted to point out is that when the church when the state is separated from the church, because they should be joined together, the modernists want to separate them. When they are separated, two things are going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is that the state is going to usurp a position above the church. We see that today. The second thing that's going to happen is that the state is going to turn against the church and end up persecuting the church, which is also what we're starting to see today. Our Lord said, "He who's not with me is against me." And as Leo XIII himself explained in the encyclical Temezi, this teaching applies not only to individuals, it also applies to the state. So when the state is separated from the church, it's not for the church. That means it's going to be against the church. So it won't take long. It will not be able to remain neutral for long. It was going to eventually, usually quickly, turn against the church. It'll become an anti-Christian state, just like we're seeing today. So those Catholics, who, again, we have the teachings of the church to guide us. We talked about how a lot of people are confused and they've been brainwashed and they've been just fed all kinds of errors. Well, as Catholics, we have the teachings of the church to guide us. So Catholics have no excuse. I guess they could be somewhat excused through ignorance. But if other Catholics have pointed this out to them, they no longer have an excuse. We have the truth to guide us in our thinking so that we're not led into error. But those misguided Catholics who reject what the popes have taught and instead promote the separation of church and state, which a lot of Catholics today do, they're playing right into the hands of the enemies of the church, because the enemies of the church know if you separate church from state, the state will turn on the church and will persecute the church. They realize that, but the misguided Catholics who reject what the church teaches do not understand that, but they're starting to see the results of it now. And the modernist, he also promotes, as we said, the separation between the Christian and the citizen. And just as the state, they say, should not be influenced by the teaching of the church, neither should the individual Catholic be influenced by the teaching of the church. Modernists claim it's an abuse of authority for the church to trace out a line of conduct to be followed by its members as citizens of the state. They say that's an abuse of authority. This is how Pius X explained this particular error in Pascendi. He said, quote, "The state must therefore be separated from the church, and the Catholic from the citizen. Every Catholic, from the fact that he is also a citizen, has the right and the duty to work for the common good in the way he thinks best, without troubling himself about the authority of the church, without paying any heed to its wishes, its counsels, its orders, nay, even in spite of its reprimands. To trace out and prescribe for the citizen any line of conduct, on any pretext whatsoever, is to be guilty of an abuse of ecclesiastical authority, against which one is bound to act with all one's might." Against which one is bound to act with all one's might, unquote. So he's basically giving the teaching of the modernists there. But it's also interesting to point out that teaching of the modernists is a one-way street. Once they're in charge, they then demand that all the Catholics conform themselves to what they teach. So the Catholics who continue to adhere to the church, the modernists, when they're in charge, they persecute them. They're no longer tolerant, saying you don't have to hear the church. When they're in charge, they become tyrants. And modernists, they're very tolerant of heresy, and they're very tolerant of true dissent, as we see with numerous theologians today, such as Father Richard McBrien or Hans Kung, who teach heresies continuously and are left alone, or with the dissident nuns from the LCWR, the Leadership Conference of Catholic Women Religious. They were completely left alone, treated with kid gloves. Yet at the same time, the modernists in the hierarchy are persecuting, or they persecute any Catholics who are traditional or who even lean towards tradition, as we see with the Franciscan Friars, the Immaculate. They were Novus Ordo who started to drift towards tradition. They started saying the old Mass, and it started becoming a little more doctrinally orthodox. And so what did the modernists do? They came down with a hammer. They suppressed them, closed their seminaries, their ordinations were suspended, their leader was basically placed under house arrest, all because they were drifting in the direction of tradition. So, again, they're real tolerant towards heresy and immorality, but they don't tolerate someone adhering to what the church has always taught. That's where they draw the line and bring down the hammer.
Yeah, it doesn't fit their chaos scheme. You made a pretty good point earlier. We're talking this whole time about the state rebelling against the church to a certain extent, and somebody could ask why that's bad. It makes me think of a son who rebels against his father. And as soon as the son does that, the insinuation is that the son knows better than the father. Or else why would he even rebel in the first place? If he admits that the father, in our case, the church, knows better, in our case, than the state, then why rebel at all? And so the insinuation is that the state knows better than the church. So the moment it separates itself from the church, it is already pretty much agreed or stated that it's now going to put the church under it. Because if the son rebels against the father, he's saying, I know better than you, now I'll tell you what to do.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, because if he thought the church knew better, why would he separate from it? He thinks he knows better, so he separates. So the state thinks it knows better, so it separates from the church. Yeah. And then it goes,
and that's what happens, Rob. Then
placed in a superior position above the church, and then it needs to dictate to the church what it should do.
Right, and that's why these modernists will see other rebels during this time of rebellion as martyrs and heroes, in a sense, fighting against the old ways of the church. And we'll see this probably in the next episode. Pius briefly talks about this as well, but they're almost looked at as heroes, leaders in this struggle. And we see this all the time in the modern age. The media loves to talk to dissenting priests, especially about sexual issues, birth control, that kind of thing as well. They'll look at them almost as beacons of enlightenment. And if a priest comes out to defend the tradition, they talk about that priest is outdated, is not with the times, is not listening to the people, that sort of thing, because they've already set themselves as their own magisterium, as we've also discussed. And so that traditional priest is now looked at as, in a sense, a heretic against the new way.
Yeah.
Well, Rob, that's as good a time any to end, so let's wrap up this episode there. Next week we'll jump paragraph, which should be on the magisterium of the church.